Washington is one of the most unchurched states in the nation, and so there is a general feeling that the religious perspective is not always appreciated or supported.
A court case involving religious liberty in Washington state reverberates across the country in the Catholic community. Can a state force a Catholic priest to break what has always been held sacred, the seal of confession? The legal battle in Washington state has brought that question to the forefront. Welcome to EWTN News In Depth. I'm Catherine Hadro. Catholic bishops challenging a state reporting law that would have violated the seal of confession notched at least a temporary win in federal court late last week. In a ruling blocking the measure, a U.S. district judge said there was no question the law burdened the free exercise of religion. And it all comes back to Catholic Church teaching about the confidentiality of what happens inside the confessional. Reporter Mark Irons begins our coverage.
A legal decision protecting the sacrament of confession and the constitutional First Amendment right to freedom of religion.
I certainly think the ruling is excellent news for religious liberty.
Last week, a federal court blocked a Washington state law that would have required Catholic priests to violate the confidential seal of confession and report certain things if they heard them confessed, with the threat of jail time or fines if they didn't. Attorney William Hahn, senior counsel at the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty, represented the Catholic bishops in Washington who sued the state. He described the unprecedented nature of the law.
There's not been a situation where a jurisdiction has said, you know what, we need to force the priest to go through something that would result in an automatic excommunication from the Catholic Church.
Priests cannot reveal what they hear in the sacred space of confession. They would be excommunicated or removed from the church for doing so. The Catholic position is explained in the Church Catechism. It states, the Church declares that every priest who hears confessions is bound under very severe penalties to keep absolute secrecy regarding the sins that his penitents have confessed to him. The Washington law passed earlier this year added clergy to a list of mandatory abuse reporters in Washington, but provided no specific exemption for what they heard in the confessional. Hahn says the court correctly recognized the law as unjust, especially as others were exempt from mandatory reporting in Washington, but not priests hearing confessions.
Washington expanded the privileges against mandatory reporting to secular professionals like attorneys or parents or caregivers. They don't have to report this kind of information. So the court was right to recognize that eliminating only the clergy's privilege showed a desire to get rid of a religiously sacrosanct practice.
We had numerous affidavits in the case from our bishops and priests saying we will violate this law because we can't possibly comply with it.
Gene Hill, the executive director of the Washington State Catholic Conference, praises the court ruling and says it was concerning when supporters of the law said the church could just change its policies.
When we confess to a priest, we're not confessing to the man sitting in front of us. We're confessing to God, who's embodied by that priest sitting in front of us. So really, the priest as a person isn't hearing what we're saying, and so he has no ability to share that beyond the confessional. And again, if he does share it beyond the confessional, then this person who's devoted their life to our church is automatically excommunicated from that vocation.
Condemnation for the law was widespread and included responses from the U.S. Department of Justice and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Bishop Robert Barron said if a penitent is aware the priest might, let alone must, share with others what was given in the most sacred confidence, he or she would be reluctant indeed to ever approach confession. The Confraternity of Catholic Clergy, representing priests around the world, said the Church's commitment to child protection can be lawfully and morally done without violating religious liberty. Hill said the same.
We are committed to protecting children from sexual abuse. And we are committed to protecting our right to the free exercise of our religion. Our policies require every adult who has significant unsupervised access to children to report to law enforcement if they have reasonable suspicions of abuse. And they go through regular training so they know what that looks like. And the judge actually noted that we have these policies in place and have done more to ensure protection of children.
The blocked law in Washington could be appealed by the state. Hahn provided more historical and national perspective on religious liberty and church-state relations. Citing one case that goes back to the 1800s, he said the seal of confession has been respected by U.S. law while the church has respected and often exceeds mandatory reporting laws.
U.S. law has recovered and protected the seal of confession. It's done it in a variety of overlapping ways. And even as mandatory reporting obligations for good reasons have come into place in state laws, the church has not only had her own mandatory reporting policies that in some cases, as they do here in Washington, exceed state law, they have always been construed in harmony with the mandatory reporting policies with states.
The sacraments don't often come up in court battles, but in previous reporting, we've heard from many Catholics who depend on the grace available in confession.
I think that the sacrament of confession is such a great place of renewal.
And I just feel the joy of being given that fresh start.
There's no substitute for the actual grace from the sacrament of confession.
Mark Irons, EWTN News in Depth.
Here to help us understand why the church defends the seal of confession so fiercely is one of the Washington state shepherds himself, Bishop Thomas Daly of Spokane. Your Excellency, welcome to the program. Okay, why is it so important to Catholics that the seal of confession never be broken? And what does that reveal about the meaning of the sacrament itself?
From its very beginning, from those words of Jesus when he gave to his church, those sins you will be held bound will be bound. Those that were loose or forgiven will be forgiven. I think the church for centuries, and we have very much examples in the past, whether it's the 14th century in Europe or it's in Mexico in the 19th century or in early 20th, where priests died rather than break the seal of confession.
Wow.
I think we have to understand that the seal is about that sacred bond of reuniting an individual with God's love and mercy. The priest is the good shepherd seeking the lost sheep. He is the father waiting for the prodigal son. He is the good Samaritan binding the wounds. And that is the basis of it. It's not, as I did in an interview, an intelligence gathering. It's not to frustrate the Justice Department or criminal justice. It is to bring the healing presence of God in the lives of the penitent, to reconcile that person. And the church has always seen this as sacred. In the catechism, it makes that clear in the Code of Canon Law. So it is just from its beginning, because the goal is that the individual be reunited with God. And anything that impedes that, because, you know, some sins are very serious. That has to be protected, and the church has fought and won on that.
And there are serious consequences within the church for any priest who breaks the confessional seal. They are immediately excommunicated, isn't that right?
Yes. And it would have to be, they'd have to seek to be reconciled because it is so serious. That penalty of excommunication by the code, you know, for example, and another issue most people sometimes forget, if a priest cannot forgive, if he forgives the sin of someone where a sin has been committed with a penitent, that also warrants a severe penalty. The phrase, I believe, is the gravest of penalties.
Wow. Can you explain why the confidentiality involved with confession is not the same as it is with therapy and counseling, for example?
Yeah. Because of its sacramental nature, a lot of times people see that connection between a therapist and someone seeking counseling, a casual conversation between a clergy, but this is sacramental. And with that sacramental bond, it places it beyond that normal conversation that might take place between, again, a therapist or even a priest who has a conversation that is not specifically framed by the prayers of the sacrament of confession. So I think for people who aren't Catholic, they just think that it's a conversation similar to any other conversation about a serious matter.
And when people hear that priests refuse to break the seal of confession, even when someone confesses abuse, for example, they may think, well, the church is not taking the protection of minors seriously. Yeah. And frankly, Your Excellency, the church does still have a lot of work to do to repair the public's trust because of the clergy sex abuse scandal. So all that being said, the church has implemented protocols and procedures to protect minors in the church. Talk about this question that people have.
Yeah, I think people, because the church, rightfully so, did not, for various reasons, depending upon where it was, certain bishops were guilty more of moving priests. They themselves perhaps abused. And I think in the perception of God's people, when you harm the children, it seems a direct, and it is, it doesn't seem, it is completely ignoring those words of Jesus, what you've done for the least ones you've done to me. And I think when Jesus talks about that millstone being placed if you harm someone, that really, it just reinforces this sacred bond. So the trust, now we have in place, if anyone volunteers, teaches in a school, is part of a parish, employment, we have strict background checks and all of that. But in the people's mind, and whenever some type of abuse case comes up or things are revealed, it affects people. People, rightfully so, protect the most vulnerable. Now, even again, it's not just children, it's vulnerable adults. And vulnerable adults can be seminarians, it could be college students, it could be employees. And so the church has expanded that thing. But still, we do have work to do, but I think a lot of progress has been made to prevent, to the best of our ability, the situation with abuse. I think we've done far more than any other organization that works with young people.
And within the church, if someone does confess abuse, what can a priest do?
Sure. I think, again, ultimately a priest does have the right, if the individual is not remorseful, to withhold absolution. Depending upon the circumstance, depending upon how long ago it happened, depending upon there are a lot of questions that could be asked about remedy this. Perhaps the priest may say, you need to turn yourself in. The priest may say, have you, do you know this family? If it's a family member, since a lot of abuse or perhaps more abuse occurs between people who know one another, whether they're relatives or some type of close friendship. So the priest does ultimately have that, but he can, it may be something that's confessed and it happened 40 years ago in another country. What would the benefit be to because you don't want to reopen a wound and say you must go back and say you're sorry to that person. Again, a lot of circumstances. I think because the confessional is sacred and it's not to be broken, that seal, there's a lot of speculation as to what happens in confession. And if you talk to most priests who hear confessions in the parish, most sins are not of that nature. In fact, in my life as a priest of 38 years, I think perhaps once I heard that sin many, many years ago. And so I think, an individual, we're looking to have that individual be reconciled to God, to receive his mercy and healing. But beyond that, it really would depend on the circumstance. So many questions.
Thank you for that clarity there. And finally, while I have you, the 3-year National Eucharistic Revival just recently came to its official close here in the U.S. And some Catholics believe for the church to cultivate a greater reverence for our Lord and the Eucharist, we first need a confession revival. What do you make of that? Can you speak to the connection that confession has to the other sacraments?
Absolutely. In my own life, as I ordained men, I said, if you want to be a good confessor, you and I have to be first good penitents, which means we have to go to confession. And I think the Eucharistic revival showed the grace, the power of the Eucharist. But I do absolutely, because people unnecessarily carry around the burdens of sin, and they forget that this is a sacrament of healing. And when we confess sins, there's a peace that comes with it and a joy. I mean, that's, why is it so often those images Jesus uses about healing that comes? And people, I think if more people knew the power of the sacrament, especially the healing grace, the sanctifying grace, the sacramental grace, the ability to be unburdened by that, there would be a lot more peace and joy. I think sometimes people have bad experiences. And one of my classmates, when he spoke as Dean of Men to the students at the seminary, Father Dono, he said, you are not there as a voyeur to question. You are there to bring the power of God's love and mercy. And the late Pope Francis really stressed that. And I think that message, when we have a great experience in confession, the healing, the power, the peace, I think more people would go more frequently. It is a tremendous sacrament.
Thank you for that reminder, and we thank you for your time this week, Bishop Daly. Thank you so much.
All right, God bless. Thank you.